Christian parenting. You're listening to the All Mom Does podcast from All Mom Does and part of the Christian Parenting Podcast Network family. I'm Julie Lyles-Carr, your host. I am a mom of 8, a best-selling author. I have been married to my husband, Michael, for quite a while now, and I am so glad that you are here. The All Mom Does podcast is just for you. It is to speak directly into your life where you are raising those kids, trying to foster that great romantic relationship, building up that career and the faith journey you're on. This is a place where you're going to find inspiration, information, resources, and community here at the All Mom Does podcast. I have a question for you. I know a lot of you are here because you're moms. You are doing the things. You are getting the teeth brushed on the little kids who hate toothpaste. You are working through potty training. You're working on college applications. You're doing it. But there is a silent population out there that I think we really want to talk about. We really want to dig into women for whom motherhood has not been everything they thought it might be, hasn't been as fulfilling, maybe wasn't even something that they were thinking they were really signing up for. My guest today, Maggie Combs, has walked through that. She has walked through a story of trying to find her way in the middle of motherhood with 3 little boys age 3 and under. Maggie, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell my listeners where you live, the kids, the husband, all the things.
So I live just kind of on the southernmost suburbs of Minneapolis, which is a crazy place to live right now.
Yes.
And we have a little hobby farm where we share some acreage with my parents. We live right next door to them, which, when you first get married, you don't want to live anywhere near your parents. And then you have your first baby and you think, like, how close can I get to you, to the babysitting? Yeah. So we live right next door to them, and we have cows and horses and fainting goats together, and we just have a great time out on the farm. Yeah, so I have 3 boys. They were born in 3 years, which was not my plan. God has different plans than we do. Not exactly how I expected motherhood to look, but they are grown up a bit now. They've got a kindergartner, a first grader, and a third grader, and I thought this was going to be my year. Where all the kids were in school and I could really
Welcome to 2020,
dig into
girl.
some more. Yeah.
Welcome to 2020.
Again, not how I planned it to be. They're great, though. I love just getting to run around with them. They keep me busy, and I've got a husband who's super active too. And that's not maybe my forte, so God has grown me a lot in motherhood. I recently learned how to do a mountain bike trail. So I'm growing.
Yes, look at you. Yeah. Maggie, one of the things I really appreciate about you is your honesty in saying, wow, for me, motherhood was not soft lullabies and picking out the perfect shade of baby blue or pink for the nursery walls. Motherhood was daunting. The on-ramp was steep. It didn't seem to come as instinctively as some women talk about. And one of the reasons I love that you have the courage to talk about this is we do paint in our culture a very romantic picture of motherhood. And for some of us, that has been the story. It is the fulfillment of something that we always wanted. But for other women, it's this place that I think you can feel a lot of shame if you've really struggled emotionally with your track to motherhood. You can feel like you could be triggering to people who are struggling to have children. And now it feels like it could be taken that you're complaining about your kids or you're not gracious or don't have gratitude for the family you have. So when did you first find the courage to give voice to, hey, I'm one of these gals that this is not coming naturally to me? How did you make that transition from trying to kind of fulfill what's seen as the ideal to raising your hand and being a truth teller about your experience?
I think my first son, he wasn't an easy baby, although I ended up having harder. But that first child, everybody told me it'll just come naturally. Breastfeeding will come naturally. It didn't. It didn't really come at all. A lot of little things. And I remember I'd call my mom and be like, this is wrong, Mom. And she's like, well, have you just tried blank? And I'm like, I was not made to do this. Like, this is not my natural bent. No, I didn't think of that. And it's the most obvious thing in the world. So I think maybe having my mom help keep my own children alive.
Right.
But it wasn't natural. And I had all these expectations for what it would look like. And I'd grown up saying, like, after I have kids, like, I don't want to work anymore. I just want to be a mom. And I had imagined all these like leisurely Target runs and fun play dates. And then I had 3 boys in 3 years. So I had a 13-month-old and a 3-year-old when my third baby was born. And suddenly I couldn't even leave the house. It was like, sorry, friends, I guess you'll have to come to me and maybe we'll have 5 minutes of conversation if we're going to have a play date. But just all the things I had built up in my mind of how great it was going to be a mom, which honestly were mostly really self-focused things, didn't come to pass. And I was like so disappointed by that. And I didn't realize why I was struggling so much, why motherhood felt so painful, but really it was the disappointments. It was those unmet expectations. And I wasn't even allowing myself to grieve and recognize that there can be grief for a dream that just never came true. And so I ended up kind of working through those things. And that became my first book on Super Mommy. And it's really just, my goal is to help moms recognize the unrealistic sometimes, or even realistic, but maybe realistic for one mom, but not realistic for their circumstances of motherhood, expectations that they had set up, and to realize that, man, I hate being weak. Like, I don't like not being able to be the best at something. I think before motherhood, I had only done things I knew I was good at.
Yeah. Which sets up the expectation. I've done all this other stuff. I'm sure I'll be great as a mom. And then when that reality is different,
Yeah, so it was my first time having to go like, oh, I'm weak. I'm not perfect. I can't do this all by my own power. And God really met me there in the verses, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And so that's what my first book is all about. Just letting go of some of those expectations and trusting that even when we feel like we are just messing up, God can redeem those things for his good plan.
Why do you think we have silenced those who are struggling? And I think sometimes we relegate it to a place of saying, well, maybe your hormones are off. And that could be true. We want people diagnostically to make sure they're doing all right. But there are those women who it really is a struggle and we tend to not discuss it. Why do you think we silence that?
I think that we have a tendency as women to, or as people in general, to compare hard things and say, well, your hard isn't as hard as my friend whose child has brain cancer, or my friend who's been struggling with infertility for years. So I don't, just keep it to yourself, okay? Because your hard just doesn't compare. But the hard thing about hard things is that they're all hard.
Right.
Like when my son falls and scrapes his knee on his bike, I don't come down to him and say, oh, baby, but mommy gave birth to you. She knows what real pain is, you know?
This is nothing compared, yeah.
We get down with them and we say, oh, I've felt pain and I'm so sorry you are experiencing it now. What can we do to help you feel better? And so that's what I'd love to see moms do is all moms have a pain of some kind. How can we come alongside of each other and say, I see your pain. I know pain. How can we help you feel better?
You know, Maggie, I think, too, we have, in more recent years, become more isolated as moms in this way. Now, I think we're connected when it comes to the socials. I think we're all comparing what our living rooms look like and all the things. That for sure is happening. But there used to be a time and a place where a community of older women were really valued as the ones who could come alongside and say, I've done this gig, I know how to do it, I can create some relief in your life. And yet it's really interesting, Maggie, one of the conversations I've been having, and I had an interview with Lisa Bevere in which we were unpacking some of this, is that generation, if you will, of that, she calls it godmothers, you know, those women who walk alongside, who've been there, a lot of that has been missing. And I have to tell you, at a lot of the parenting conferences I speak at and things of that nature, some of the questions that I get are people saying, I don't have any kind of grandparents for my kids in my kids' lives, or my parents, God bless them, but they're going off and living their best life in Aruba, like they're not around. So how much do you think it has impacted today's moms that there aren't necessarily some of the same community resources of older women who've been there, who've done that, who've lived through the teething, who've gotten through the potty training, who've gotten through the days that are just hard, that maybe those voices aren't really resonating, or they're just not there sometimes for a younger generation of moms?
I think there's a few things happening, at least from my I'm a mid-motherhood perspective, right? Sometimes because of social media and because of the internet presence, we have all this advice about how to do things online. So we look there first, but we also, and we don't reach out to that older mom, but we also may have a tendency to disregard the wisdom of the older mom because there's this newfangled way of doing it, right? And we want the new thing. We think whatever is being touted on Instagram as the smart new way to do motherhood must be the right way. And so I think there's a humility required to reach out to an older mom and say, like, maybe she hasn't read all these books that I've had, but she's done it. And so there's that. And then there's also, so some of the older moms, I think, just feel silenced. Like they can't share, especially, in that like mom, your mom relationship with your kids, if you have, or your mother-in-law, like, they feel like, well, I don't know if I should say anything because I don't want to. So I think being the first one to reach out and ask, or to join into some groups in your local church. I love intergenerational Bible study for this. It just gets you with women, and it gets you out of your head a little bit as a mom, where you think this moment in time is the hardest thing that could possibly be happening. And then you're hearing the stories of women of all ages and what they're going through, and they're reminding you of God's faithfulness in their age. And it helps you to see what he's doing in your life. And then also even joining like a local moms group or MOPS group, where they might have, some of them have mentor moms. And so that's a great person who's to make a connection with, because she said, I care about the mothers of the next generation. I want to invest in them.
Right. I love that. And you're right. We do in our school classrooms, right? We only have third graders with third graders. We only have fifth graders with fifth graders. We've been trained to basically just hang out with the people our age, the people who are in the life same experience. And of course, that can be a beautiful and wonderful thing to have a friend who's going through the same ages and stages with you. I've always valued those friendships deeply, but you're so right. When we get too focused on only hanging out with the people who are in our age or are having the same life experience, we miss out on a whole wealth of things. And that humility piece is really fascinating to me too, because we tend to think of good moms as moms who just seem to know how to do it just naturally. And so you're right, that willingness to say, I don't have it figured out, I'm needing some help, I'm needing some input from someone, does require that courage to be humble. And because, none of us want to be thought of as the girl who couldn't figure out how to be a mom. That's a hard thing. That's a really hard thing. But at the same time, so incredibly powerful to be able to raise your hand and say, I'm needing some help here. Let me ask you about this. You touched on it. And I think this is very powerful. I don't know a lot of people who've had the courage to say it, which is within your own story, the self-focused nature you had when it came to what you thought your mothering story was going to be. And yet I think for many of us, if we're honest and we really unpack in those places in our motherhood that we were looking to be a mom, there was a whole lot of self-fulfillment involved in it. And of course, the reality of motherhood is it is very much a laying down of so many things. And it's been one of the concerns I've had for women for several years now, because the notion of you can have it all, you can do it all, the notion of you've got to take care of yourself first. And I totally buy into the metaphor about when the mask drops in the airplane, you got to make sure your mask is on, you're taking good care of yourself. But I've also seen that skid into a lane in which this notion of self-care, this notion of taking care of myself so I can be everything I can be for my kids, sometimes the message of, y'all, being a mom is going to require self-sacrifice and inconvenience, and sometimes being real tired, and sometimes eating peanut M&Ms for dinner, just confessing a little issue that I've had my own this week.
That's kind of a genius idea.
Yeah.
It's protein, right?
See what I'm saying? It feels like a treat. You're also getting the protein. It's like dessert and a protein. Yeah. Thank you, friend. I feel seen, Maggie. Thank you. So how do we lovingly, and not condemning, not shaming, but call it out on ourselves, help us see it in each other, when sometimes our notion of motherhood does have this very self-focused perspective about our own fulfillment and the story that we have wanted to build. And now we're faced with kids that don't necessarily fit neatly into some categories for us.
Well, I want to touch on a couple of things from that. First is what I hear in myself when I say that, and you talking, is that we've made motherhood our identity. And when it's our identity, it has to serve us. Even in, Christian communities, we're told like motherhood is the highest calling. And so we expect it to be this wonderful, important thing. And then when we get down to it, and it's really making lunches and helping with homework, and it just doesn't feel that important, like maybe somebody else can do it. It can't carry the weight of our identity. Only God can carry the weight of our identity. And so motherhood is a good way that we fulfill our ultimate calling, which is to glorify God, to go and make disciples of all nations. But it can't bear the weight of our entire identity. Only God was made to do that. So that's one thing, one way that once we put it in its proper place, not elevating it above our primary calling, but making it a way that we do our primary calling, then we can see it as an act of service. And that instead of how do I find my identity and purpose in the work that I'm doing today, becomes how does God want me to serve today in His kingdom? Sometimes that's motherhood. Sometimes it's going out and speaking to other people. Sometimes it's working as in a warehouse, right? But how is God asking me to fulfill my calling today? And then the other piece I hear you saying, which is, I think, the problematic thing about self-care, is that I love the idea of rest. So don't get me wrong. Women need rest. And what you said about putting on your oxygen mask first, the problem is we often are putting on a mask and it's not giving us oxygen. We think it's giving us oxygen, but only God's presence gives us true rest. And so when we search out all of these other things, we don't find true rest. And so part of good self-care, which I like to call soul care, is finding, first of all, the perspective that I don't deserve this. I need this because I'm not God. Only God doesn't need rest. And so sometimes it's doing the same activity. It might be going and taking a bath instead of cleaning the bathroom at nap time. But it's the attitude, it's the motivation, whether you're saying, I deserve this now, or whether you're saying, I can't do everything unless I rest. And I can trust God to give me the time and the opportunity to do what must be done today, even while taking the rest that my body requires. So I like to look at it more as soul care. And sometimes that does mean, instead of the TV show, you choose God's word too. And sometimes it just means redeeming the attitude of your heart towards those ways that you take rest. And that's how we get true oxygen. And that's what we need to live.
I think that is a fantastic explanation of making sure we know what is coming through the oxygen mask, because you're so right. There are times that we are just, and it's not wrong to have a time that you're just breathing something fruity, just, just to have a little bit of a break. But you're right. So often I will tend to go toward things that are mindless or a little bit numbing because I've gotten stressed or the pressures around me of trying to juggle all the things. And yet really what's needed, what do nutritionists tell us? They say that often we will pick up something snacky that's probably not good for us. And actually what it is that we're thirsty. And we often misalign the cues that we're getting. And I'm certainly one who will tend to go toward things that aren't really that oxygen for the soul. They're more just something I'm doing to kind of soothe, a little bit of a dental chair kind of thing, like just give me the nitrous instead of the oxygen.
Yeah.
So
Your
really
M&Ms are really the perfect example because it's like, it's a momentary escape.
Right.
And as long as we know this is momentary, this isn't going to last me, that's kind of okay. But when we put our hope in it, like, man, if I can just have that 5 minutes alone in the pantry with the cookie jar, then I'll make it through the rest of my day. That's not enough hope to make it through the rest of your day.
Yeah.
You need 5 minutes alone in God's word. Then you can make it through the rest of the day, you know?
Right. Well, maybe eating a handful of peanut M&Ms for the protein,
exactly.
Maggie. For the protein. I want to be really clear about that. Maggie, a friend of mine here in the Austin area, she's a therapist and she does a lot of work with women who are struggling to figure out their pace and their cadence within motherhood. Why do you think that women sometimes find difficulty in linking arms on this topic? So through your work, are you finding more women who are now standing up and saying, this is me too, and here's how we can create a supportive community? Or do you think sometimes women, in trying to link arms who are struggling to find their way in motherhood, does it become almost potentially just a complaining session about motherhood, where the corollary to mom shaming is something that turns into just this mom pitying, like it's all doom and gloom? How can we be cautious to make sure that within our honesty about the challenges we may be having in motherhood, that it doesn't turn into some kind of strange resentment or some kind of coalition that is not necessarily anti-motherhood, but is certainly not existing for the context of serving kids well while also walking out our own stories?
It's swinging too far on the other pendulum, right?
Right.
Going into the other ditch. I think part of the problem is that we too often think I'll link arms with someone online. And things get pretty extreme on social media. I'm not sure if you've noticed.
Just a smidge.
So I think I would encourage women, first of all, link arms with someone in real life. Be honest about what you're struggling with someone you know in real life. And I think what you'll find is someone who's ready to say, oh, me too. We're so less likely to pass judgment on people in real life than we are online. I think second, the only way to keep it from just becoming a motherhood bash fest is to remember that our hope isn't in motherhood, it's only in Christ. And to tell each other about that, point each other back that way. This is uncomfortable as a moms at first. You can do it without minimizing the pain that she is, but just say, oh, I see that. I feel that in my own life. Should we search out God's word together on that? Or do you know, I hear you suffering. Do you know that Christ suffered as well? He knows what suffering looks like. We are not suffering alone. And I think when we do that, those conversations that could just turn into a total free-for-all become centered on truth. And so even when there are these hard circumstances happening, the truth and all kinds of, let's be honest, all kinds of changes in motherhood happening right now.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
Plus, isn't motherhood always like, oh, I kind of got this figured out. Oh, here's this brand new stage. I have no idea.
Changes again, yeah. And you're right. That is part of the nature of motherhood, and to remind one another of that in loving ways, because I can remember somebody telling me that after the birth of my first child, and I felt like it was so patronizing. Well, this is a stage, this is a season. Maggie, that's the truth. I mean, the seasons that we're in, and yeah, we may have figured out school for last year, and this year's school looks nothing like what we would have thought, but that was probably going to happen anyway. Maybe not in this kind of context, but it was going to happen when your kid entered a new phase, entered a new experience in their scholastic world. You're so right. I mean, motherhood is always changing. To that end, you have a phrase that I think is a really great one. You have talked about the stressful standards of motherhood and some of the rules that we put around motherhood. And there are those cultural rules that go around motherhood. Then I think there are also within our faith communities, the rules that seem to be around motherhood. And I'm not saying that there is actually a pamphlet or a monument where these things are chiseled in stone, but what are some of the things that are the stressful standards that we've put on moms that if you're already struggling as a mom, almost make you feel like, okay, I don't think I can ever get above surface on this?
I think one of the biggest ones right now in particular is everything depends on you. And as moms, we'll say it out of frustration. Well, everything depends on me when we get really exhausted. Or we'll kind of wear it like a badge. Like, you see these children over here? That's right. I keep them alive every day. And that sets us up as queens in our little kingdoms. And what happens then is that when we're queen, when we're sovereign, we have to be in control at all times.
Yeah.
And we hold so tightly to that control. So that's why I put as the gospel truth for that stressful standard, it's that really God is the best parent. We have a heavenly Father who's both parenting us and our children, and he is in control. And so we can rest in his good plan instead of having to always be striving, playing the blame shame game on ourselves, or maintaining absolute control over every choice and decision and plan that our family makes.
Absolutely. And this gets into that whole place of identity again, because I think often one of the stressful standards we put upon ourselves is that our children will be a direct reflection of how well we have parented. And I have said before from stage and in some different panels, listen, guys, God has 7 billion kids, and there are those who are following him, but he's got a lot of kids who at this point don't reflect him, but neither do they reflect in a negative way or anything else, a statement about his goodness as a father. And that desire to try to control often the way that our kids present to the world and how they're handling things and what their manners are like and how they're getting their grades in the classroom and all the things is actually one of those places, again, that flip again of us trying to seek identity through our children's accomplishments and how our children are perceived. That's one of those standards that is just impossible to uphold, because the reality is your kids are gonna do some stuff you didn't see coming. They're gonna reveal something at the big extended family dinner, or they're going to have a day at school where you're like, what happened? And it doesn't mean that you as a mom haven't done your job. So to be willing to excise some of those standards that don't serve us well is a really, really powerful thing in order to stay in a place that is healthy and is about serving and raising our kids to be who they're supposed to be without our identity getting all wrapped up in it. Now, you brought up, and this is so true in this day and age, one of the things that sociologists are telling us that we're going to be feeling the ramifications of for quite a while is that during the pandemic, during quarantine, when so many people have been trying to juggle both work and dealing with their kids' school schedules and hybrid schedules and virtual learning and all the things, sociologists are telling us that women are the ones who are bearing the brunt of that they believe it will impact the workforce years forward, that it's going to be impacting the trajectory of women's careers moving forward, because we now have this standard where a lot of women are the ones who, by practicum, are carrying a lot of the responsibility. How do you see that impacting the women that you speak to, the women that you minister to, as they're navigating this and watching how it plays out?
I think that it kind of flips back to that self-care situation again. We feel that we are in charge of not just making sure that our kids come out of this okay, but that we know, we've been told so many times, but that we also have to be concerned about getting our own needs met. Mm-hmm. And so it goes again back to God as our parent, because I like to tell this little story, like we go up to the cabin a few hours away several weekends every summer. And my boy, I spend a whole day beforehand planning out that we have everything that we need, right? And especially for that 3-hour car ride, we need a lot of snacks, okay? As long as my boys are fed, they're happy. So I've got all of these snacks planned out, and I make sure they have a nice little pillow to lean against and all of those things. And I've spent all day doing this, and then we say, like, okay, boys, it's time to go to the cabin. And what do they have to do? They have to get in the car. Yeah, they just get in the car. And then it inevitably, every time one of them will go, I don't have my blank water bottle, granola bars, whatever. And I'll say, like, oh, just, reach down at your feet in that little bag. And there it is, exactly what they need. And that brings joy to me. And joy to them too, right? They're always like, oh, yes, you knew exactly what I need and you gave it to me. And that's how it works with God, right? We kind of get in the car and we don't actually have a good perspective on what we need. And we're looking around and we're flustered. If we reach out to God, he's going to say, actually, I have exactly what you need right here. And then he reveals that. And I get joy from that. And he gets glory from it. And we all get to participate in this cycle of my needs being recognized and met by the Heavenly Father brings him glory and brings me joy. And so that's what I would encourage women to do, is just take time to pray and take time to reach out and ask and expect that God will meet your needs in this time.
It's beautiful. So the new book is Motherhood Without All the Rules, Trading Stressful Standards for Gospel Truths. Maggie, thank you so much for your willingness to disclose something that, again, we don't really like to refer to very much. But when motherhood doesn't come naturally, what then? And how to set yourself up to thrive, to really soak into God's goodness for your plan, for your life, all the things. Maggie, I really appreciate your honesty and vulnerability. And I know it's going to be so great for the listeners. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Check out our show notes where you can connect with our guest and find out more. Do me a favor and subscribe and share the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, and leave a 5-star rating and review. It helps get the word out about the podcast, and I thank you so much. Connect with me, particularly over on Instagram. I love me the grams. I'm Julie Lyles Carr there. I'm so thankful to interact with listeners each week. I just love it. So head on over and say hi. Thank you to Rebecca, our content coordinator, and Donna, our producer, the dynamic duo who make this podcast possible. Go to allmomdoes.com for an awesome resource and community for women walking through many of the same things you do with kids and spouses and work and faith. It's such a great place for you to connect and refresh. I'll see you next week with another fantastic episode of the Modern Motherhood Podcast.